everyone, I'm Minar Mohawish, and thank you again for tuning in to Mid Press News' Behind the Headline, a citizen-led project created in partnership with Free Speech TV. This show is made possible by over 300 citizen sponsors and several business partners. Now, to learn more about them, you can visit our website at midpressnews.com. Now, let's get behind the headline. Foreign policy is a cornerstone of every presidential campaign. More than foreign aid or identifying our allies, though, a prospective president's foreign policy can be examined through a willingness or unwillingness to go to war. But ultimately, it's up to the public to decide, do we want more war? Well, according to a CNN poll conducted in late April and early May, the country is evenly split on just that. Do you favor or oppose the United States sending ground troops into combat operations against ISIS forces in Iraq or Syria? That question was answered with 48% said that they would support sending in ground troops to combat ISIS, but the other 48% didn't. When the question is framed to the public as fighting an evil enemy without the context, of course, that our own foreign policy is giving rise to terrorism, is it really that surprising that nearly half of Americans support more bombs? Now consider the candidates from our two major parties. Donald Trump, the Republican nominee who has vowed to send in ground troops to knock the hell out of ISIS, and Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee whose own ties to ISIS were recently exposed by WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks' Julian Assange says her emails indicate that she sold weapons to ISIS in Syria during her time as Secretary of State, and she's also made money from her ties to companies working for and funding ISIS. So Clinton, it seems, may be able to have her cake and eat it too by profiting from the very source of terrorism she both helped to embolden and promised to defeat. Trump, on the other hand, who has never held public office, so he has no voting record to examine. What he does have, though, is a never-ending string of comments that reveal him as a xenophobic racist. But he was not a fan of the Iraq War, even if only because it put his own business interests in jeopardy. And as Senator and Secretary of State, Clinton built a consistent and horrifying record of warmongering that destabilized dozens of nations while helping to create ISIS and fuel the very terrorism across the Middle East and Africa that the Democratic claims to want to fight. But it's her support and advocacy for the Iraq War, a war in which nearly 200,000 Iraqi civilians and 4,500 U.S. service personnel have been killed, that left a scar on Americans who at one point opposed war. Now, one of those fallen U.S. soldiers was Casey Sheehan, a U.S. Army specialist who died on April 4th, 2004. Now, in the wake of his death, his mother, Cindy Sheehan, became a vocal anti-war activist. In 2005, the Peace Mom camped outside of President George Bush's ranch in Texas for several weeks, vowing to stay there until she got a face-to-face meeting with the president himself, who she said never had a good reason for going to war in the first place. Now, she's been arrested during multiple anti-war protests in the years since then, and she also produces a blog and podcast, Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox, which tackles the U.S. empire that spreads war around the world. Now, she's here on Behind the Headline to talk to me about where the anti-war movement is today and whether any presidential candidate can bring that with them any hope for a world without war. Now, Cindy, thank you so much for joining me today. You've been extremely critical of the anti-war movement, and so have I, as we've seen them kind of jump on the Hillary bandwagon. Where is the anti-war movement today?
There's very little anti-war movement in the United States. There are some of us who are anti-empire, and we have been working against Obama and his wars, but it hasn't been a mass movement. It's been very small, and it seems to have been very localized. And there's been no mass demonstrations in Washington, D.C. against the Obama's wars. He's now bombing Libya. There seems to be very little opposition to that. And then, of course, Bernie Sanders just ran for the nomination of the Democratic Party to be president. His record in these, these issues are very bad. The only thing he can claim is that he voted against the invasion of Iraq when he had already voted to give George Bush authorization to use military force against the so-called war on terror. yeah, well, I usually call it a war of terror that the U.S. is committing against the world. And so all these people like got behind Bernie Sanders, again, thinking that he was some kind of peace candidate. He rarely, if ever, addressed foreign policy. And if he did, he said things like he could use the unmanned aerial vehicles to drone bomb countries, like Barack Obama has done. And so all these people who I think would be more anti-war and more with us in the streets and at protests, they get co-opted by the Democratic Party time and time again. And the Democratic Party is just as hostile as the Republican Party.
Right. And speaking of pro-war candidates, with the presidential campaigns in full swing, you recently said you reflected on the two major party candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. You asked, which is worse, background checks or a mass murderer? Are these really our only choices? And are the candidates any different than what we've had in the last 4 years or maybe 8 years ago?
Of course, Donald Trump has said things like he believes that people who want to immigrate to the United States from Muslim countries, Arab countries, should be subjected to more vigorous background checks than people coming from other countries. And although I oppose that, Hillary Clinton has been supportive of bombing Arab countries, and which has resulted, Arab Muslim countries, which has resulted in mass murder in Libya, tens of thousands, in Iraq, hundreds of thousands, Syria, Yemen, the list goes on and on. And of course, voting for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump is not our only choice. I prefer that people be out in the streets to have a mass movement to force policy change. And since we haven't seen that, you could vote. People on the right can vote for Gary Johnson, although I don't think his record's very good in speaking out against empire. People can vote for Jill Stein of the Green Party, although she's not really the nominee yet, but she probably will be. I'm voting for Gloria La Riva of the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in California. If voting, but voting's not the solution anyway. And like I said in the question about Sanders, a lot of progressive left-wing energy gets just sucked in presidential politics where there's very little chance of change.
Now, I want to jump into another conversation, another topic. I mean, as a mother who lost her son in the Iraq War, and as an activist who has confronted presidents and administrations and politicians on the military-industrial complex, what would you say to the Khan family as they lay out their grief on the public stage who criticized Donald Trump?
So here they are. They're saying something about someone who's a candidate, Trump, who hasn't made any policy decisions or policy votes, but they're supporting somebody who really, I think, has been very destructive in her public life.
Right, and I'm glad you talked about that because, this leads me to my next question is, what would you say to Donald Trump, whose response to the Khazir and Ghazala Khan couple, the parents of the Muslim soldier, like your son who was killed in Iraq, has been nothing short of disgraceful?
It's like telling my 5-year-old grandson he should apologize for something he's not sorry about. I'm not sure Donald Trump is sorry about what he said. However, like I said before, Donald Trump, his question to them was, why are you mad at me? Hillary Clinton voted for the war that killed your son. And so why aren't they demanding that Hillary Clinton apologize for that vote? And so I think it's just a media controversy that isn't focused on the correct thing. Donald Trump has extremely belligerent rhetoric. I think somebody should take away his iPhone so he can't tweet anymore. When I was in Crawford, Texas in 2005, and when I was doing, my activism, I'm still doing it, but when everybody was focused on my activism, when the corporate media was focused on it, they said that George Bush was kind to me, that George Bush said, that she has a right to her opinion. But George Bush had Karl Rove, and Karl Rove and his minions attacked me thoroughly. So I just think, and I've said, if the cons really believe in their cause, then they shouldn't care what Donald Trump says about them. And Donald Trump, I don't really understand how he became the nominee for the Republican Party in the first place, but he really just needs to think twice before he sends those despicable tweets out into the universe. Once they're out there, you can't pull them back.
Well, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks. It was great to talk to you.
Talk to you soon. Thank you. Disney, Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, Bill Maher, and former U.S. government officials. Seems like a pretty random list, right? Well, they have one surprising thing in common, and that's Vice. And no, I'm not talking about porn, gambling, or drugs. I'm talking about the multimedia empire that's leading the mainstream media machine in producing edgy reporting behind a hipster, cooler-than-thou facade. Vice, the brand, is built around an anti-establishment vibe that's always feeling the pulse on the fringe. So how did the brand go from producing a niche magazine in Canada focused on street style and sex to being a bona fide multimedia empire that includes a popular website, growing digital footprint, and partnerships with major corporations? Well, the shift happened gradually. $200 million from Disney here, $70 million from Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox, making the media mogul 10% owner there. Then there's a talk show sponsored by Bank of America and another sponsored and hosted by career Islamophobe Bill Maher. Not to mention giving world-famous puppet master George Soros, who funds coups in favor of NATO around the world, his own segment. Now the list goes on, and perhaps it's too long to mention all here, but Vice Media expanded by quietly embracing the very corporate and government entities that hold the least credibility with its own liberal audience. And while positioning itself as a ballsy, no-holds-barred alternative to the mainstream media, Vice has actually become the mainstream media. Now, Vice hasn't just sold itself out to the neocon agenda, it's also normalized that agenda among its audience through its growing digital platform. Now, sure, Vice still bucks the government line on issues like marijuana legalization and does stories on what people should wear to get laid, but on stories of foreign policy, Vice's tone tends to align with Washington's maneuverings, including the re-emergence of Cold War narratives, pushing Russia phobia and justifying NATO's aggressive posturing towards Russia in Ukraine and Syria. And as Robbie Martin notes in part 3 of his documentary series, A Very Heavy Agenda, Vice achieved what Fox News terrorism fear-mongering could never achieve: fear of Islamic terrorism among young American liberals, to justify, of course, those so-called humanitarian bombs. Now, Vice News has become a tool of soft propaganda. Its reporters frequently cite outlets like Voice of America and Voice of Asia broadcasters, which fall under the umbrella of the U.S. state-sponsored Broadcasting Board of Governors that pushes U.S. interests abroad. Now, Vice, it turns out, is an ideal vehicle for delivering Cold War interventionist messages to a generation that knows better than to trust the mainstream media or the government. The problem is that generation doesn't seem to realize that Vice is the mainstream media and it is pushing government narratives. Now, Robbie Martin is here to talk more about how Vice gets away with towing the line of the establishment and how it's helping shape a new breed of pro-war young liberals. Check it out.
So when Vice lost Gavin McInnes, Vice apparently was completely taken over by their marketing side. So Shane Smith was their marketing guy, and he took over the content and started running the magazine completely himself. And from there, it sort of evolved into this thing called Vice News, where HBO had an actual Vice News program that was produced in part by the extremely Islamophobic Bill Maher. So that's was, I think, the start of it. But what you started seeing very quickly with Vice News is a lot of their coverage of really important issues happening around the world, like in Venezuela, in Syria, in Iraq, especially in Ukraine, was very slanted noticeably towards a sort of pro-Western narrative, and in some cases actually a pro-US government narrative, but at times actually being a very subtle form of that. I believe that the bias was very clear, And I think it all came to a head when they got this incredible access to ISIS before most of the world had even heard of them. And they actually got to do like a ride along. Now, these were apparently stringer camera people who weren't officially working for Vice. But time and time again, Vice gets this incredible access to battlefields in Syria and Iraq. They have a whole episode where they're essentially promoting the work of the FSA, which are the CIA-funded Syria rebels, as if they're doing good and noble work. So there's a lot of very questionable content that they put out like that.
Right, and speaking of the pro-war establishment, you talk about Voice of America and Voice of Asia, broadcasters which fall under the umbrella of the U.S. state-sponsored Broadcasting Board of Governors as new partners with Vice. These are obviously soft propaganda tools used to push a U.S. agenda abroad. How is Vice normalizing that neoconservative agenda of promoting U.S. imperialism and aggression through these tools?
Well, the Broadcasting Board of Governors is a body that now encapsulates all of the U.S. state-funded media outlets across the world, that we spend almost $1 billion a year on this program to beam pro-American messages into mostly focusing on hostile areas or hot spots in the world that could tip either way. They could tip in America's favor. Some of these nations can tip in Russia's favor. But what Vice is doing with the BBG is you see all these Vice stories, mostly in print, which have actual citations or information contained in them from the BBG. And keep in mind that Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, was actually funded by the CIA at one point, and it was under the guise of it was under the umbrella of the Office of Information, the U.S. propaganda arm. Now it's trying to present itself as more legit. So you'll see in the Vice print articles many references. I found over 40 over a 3-year period where they actually would insert something from Radio Free Europe. But what was really striking is they never mentioned when they did this that it was a U.S. state-funded outlet. However, whenever they mention RT or Sputnik or anything having to do with any other country's state-funded media model, they'll make that part of the story. They'll be like, this is the Kremlin state media funded RT or whatever. They just casually are dropping US funded state propaganda in tons of articles. And when I actually asked authors of Vice articles that had this content in them, some of them didn't even know it was there. An editorial decision was made over their head to actually insert it into their article after they had written it. So that speaks to a troubling pattern. That's not just a random, author for Vice deciding to put this in on them themselves.
Right, and I'm really glad that you talked about that and pointed that out, because we have some pretty big names that are, invested big in Vice. Bank of America, Rupert Murdoch, Disney, Fox News, former U.S. government officials, and even pro-war and what I like to call career Islamophobe Bill Maher. These are just some of the examples of the people and corporate entities most distrusted by young anti-establishment liberals, yet they've basically teamed up with Vice in one way or the other. But how much longer do you think Vice can maintain this illusion? I mean, what happened to young people's bullshit monitors that Vice co-founder Shane Smith has famously mentioned as a reason why an outlet like Vice is so important?
Well, I think what happened to people's bullshit monitors is Vice snuck through them because Vice, in a lot of ways, is superficially this liberal, hip, cutting edge, sex positive, drug positive. It has all of the elements that young people would glom onto. But what happened was once it passed through that membrane, it's firing on all cylinders, in my opinion, of pro-US and pro-Western narratives on these really crucial foreign policy issues happening all over the world. Another great example is the Ukraine Russian roulette special. They went for over 100 episodes and somehow omitted that the US government admitted to spending $5 billion to foster regime change in Ukraine. Now, they covered every single corrupt thing under the sun involving Russia. They combed over every single detail involving that, but yet they didn't mention even the most obvious, blatant ways the U.S. was involved in flipping the government of Ukraine.
Right. There's obviously a major rise in Russia phobia, Putin phobia. And you point out that actually hipster propaganda like Vice are leading the way in pushing that. How has Vice, if you can give me a very specific example, shaped the narrative about Ukraine and Russia?
Well, it started very subtle. So I think that they were one of the outlets that put quite a lot of attention on things like Pussy Riot's arrest or the Russian gay propaganda law. Vice was one of the biggest outlets constantly trying to push these subjects into headlines on a daily basis. And keep in mind, they were also doing this around the same time that other millennial outlets. Now, this is really important to remember, is these are millennial style outlets like BuzzFeed and the Daily Beast, where very much on board with this anti-Russian narrative that all sort of started around the same time. But I believe what Vice was doing was more insidious because they didn't have neocons writing articles for them. They didn't have neocons going on their news channel. It was all done under all these new faces, all these young adventure tourist style, kids fresh out of college who are barely being paid anything. So in a lot of ways, it actually, I believe, played on the gullibility of young people and people who don't have much of a political conviction, especially about restarting the Cold War, which is something that the CIA and the BBG were exploiting back in the 1960s. They wanted to eliminate what they called Cold War neutrality, specifically among intellectual liberals. And in this case, I believe that the U.S. State Department is trying to reach liberal millennials to try to feed this propaganda, and Vice is just one of the means in which they do this.
Right, and obviously, the crisis in Syria is also influencing young people's perspective about, Muslims and Islam. How has Vice helped influence young liberals' view of Islam to justify U.S. bombs in the Middle East and in Africa?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's tricky to answer because on one hand, their style of newsmaking, especially their ISIS specials, is very much like a fly on the wall. There's barely any commentary, but the commentary is done through the editing and the scary, music and all that kind of things. The editorial point of view is there, but I would almost draw a parallel about black on black crime. This whole concept that the right wing, is hysterical about. Imagine if, to address the black plight in the United States, Vice made a special showing only black on black crime. That to me is what they've done with the ISIS special. They show it with no context. They make these people seem like total barbaric monsters who are basically like serial killers running rampant in Iraq and Syria with virtually no context of how the U.S. Created the situation in the first place, how there are a lot of regular citizens who feel trapped by ISIS and feel like that they have to work with them, but instead they don't show that gray area, the distinction, that some of these people in ISIS might actually just be regular people who are caught up in a terrible situation. But then you have this special where they show rebels, pro-U.S. rebels in Iraq and Syria, and they're portrayed great, like they're heroes. There's no talk about U.S.-funded rebels beheading a Palestinian child or anything like that. Of course, it's just why isn't the U.S. funding these people more? It's actually trying to advocate for more CIA funding of rebels, which is quite bizarre for a millennial hip news network, I think.
And of course, none of this could really be even possible without somebody within the company driving Vice into this direction. You previously mentioned Vice's co-founder, Shane Smith, who really kind of gives off this badass vibe. He's really the face behind Vice. Give me some examples of how Shane Smith and his ties to the neocons drove Vice into this direction.
I think Shane Smith is the key to a lot of this. To me, he seems very gullible, politically speaking. He seems like he is a marketing guy. He did get very rich very quickly. And I believe all of those factors enable, and this may be too gracious towards him, is a vulnerability inside his company where because they switched to a marketing-driven model where they actually will have now Bank of America and other corporations producing content for them, literally. I think to someone like Shane Smith, it's not that big of a deal to have the US State Department producing content for him, or to be suggesting content, or the White House to be suggesting content for him, like as we saw in the Obama prison special that Vice did, which happened right after Alyssa Mastromonaco, a White House chief of staff member, one of Obama's top advisors, became COO at Vice. So once we started seeing that jump, we just started seeing actual Vice specials that had all this White House coordination. And then, of course, Shane Smith wants his viewers to see him hugging Joe Biden and laughing it up with Joe Biden and being enamored of Joe Biden. For some reason, Shane Smith thinks that's something to be proud of as a journalist. But of course, he's out as he's not a journalist, and none of the people at Vice are journalists. They're just young people who are trying to figure out the world. I mean, that's the whole mindset that he's trying to put out, is that they're not real journalists. Well, actually, you are working in journalism, and you're a very, very bad journalist who's doing things that, in my mind, should be seen as not only unethical, but also inappropriate for a journalist to be doing. But then there's a lot of other troubling details, like Rupert Murdoch owns 10% of Vice, and Shane Smith doesn't seem to have a problem with that. Disney now owns a very large chunk of Vice. So on one hand, we have them evolving into a very generic mainstream news model, but on the other hand, we do have interesting, weird things that Vice is involved in that no other news network is focusing on during this sort of growth phase. One of them is Shane Smith admitted to airing a free block of programming in Eastern Europe in 2014 during sort of the Euromaidan uprising. I'm not sure if he understands how volatile something like that would be to do. I think that he's just found himself in this very good opportunistic position where he can make a lot of money and somehow get away with being a pro-US government propagandist without being called out on it by his audience, which so far hasn't really happened.
Well, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on. Such a great conversation. Robbie Martin, filmmaker and director of A Very Heavy Agenda. Everyone should check it out.
Thank you, Manar.
Well, thank you again for joining me today. You can catch up on all of our episodes on our website at mintpressnews.com, or you can keep the conversation going with me online on Twitter and on Facebook. See you next week.